So, when people talk about changing a habit, they often treat human behavior as a software update where you can download the latest routine, download the easiest healthy eating habits, and then all of a sudden it's boom, you're like version 2.0 of yourself. And unfortunately, that is not the case, and it's why many of us struggle so hard to make changes in our lives. A study I found with just people who start their plans at New Year, there were only 46 people that remained continuously successful in that 6 month mark. This means more than half of the people abandon their goals by the middle of the year. Crazy, right? But very common. We usually explain failure as like a lack of discipline or, I didn't try hard enough, I didn't want it badly enough, or I lack sufficient willpower, to say the least. But it is actually a lot more complicated than a lot of people think. So, when it comes to long term change, it becomes more sustainable when the behavior is aligned with the person's self concept. So, if there are any underlying beliefs about the person that remains unchanged, then it's just going to look like a temporary performance change and you'll end up right back in the same old pattern. So, let me explain what I mean by this. So, for years, the dominant idea about willpower was that it was some type of limited resource, kind of like a battery. The more you use it, it depletes over time until you recharge it. That was the sort of thing that we were dealing with. So, a classic example of this was a study done where they asked participants to resist tempting food and then complete a difficult task. Well, as you could probably see this happening, a lot of the participants who resisted the temptation actually quit sooner when it came to the difficult task, which actually showed more of self control depleting than willpower itself. This didn't mean that the people never became mentally tired. So I don't want to have you assume that that's what that means. It just suggested that willpower may not operate like just a simple fuel tank of we're here and then once we're empty, we can no longer do this, second, third. It just means that like motivation, meeting, like your expectations, and more importantly, your internal narrative of yourself that influences this type of behavior of change. So, if you have a person that believes they're not a morning person, to say the least, this is what they always tell themselves, this is their internal monologue, and they force themselves to have a 5 a.m. routine, you are going against that internal conflict, which creates even more of a friction point for you. Now you're just repeatedly acting against your self image because your self image of what you feel you are on the inside is not a morning person. So forcing 5 a.m. morning routine on yourself is not going to do much and will do more harm than good. Now, there is one outcome based goal that you can switch to what I would consider an identity based behavior. This would be like instead of saying outcome wise, I want to lose 20 pounds, right? Your identity based statement would be, I am becoming someone who moves my body every day. So instead of saying I should read more books, then you would say I'm becoming a reader. You see the difference in those two statements? So the goal is not to pretend that the identity already exists in the full reality. Because if you make any type of empty declarations, you can create more resistance for yourself. And since you don't have any evidence to support them, it looks like you're basically a fraud because in your mind, in your internal monologue, you are not a person that has been exercising in years. So you can't just say outright, I am a runner. That's not how that works. Instead, to bridge yourself from the current self and your desired self is evidence. And this is what we're going to get into next. So, the best way to think of the bridge between your current self and your desired identity is look at it as an election, right? Each action that you're taking is a vote towards the person you want to become. So, if you're putting in a vote on running shoes for your running identity, that vote goes into that bucket. If you're reading 2 pages, that is a vote for your reading identity, so on and so forth. And just like with any election, it doesn't have to be unanimous for you to become that version of yourself. You just have to, over time, accumulate evidence that makes that identity more believable, more realistic. Now, something I really want to address when it comes to habit formation is that it's a lot slower than you think, but it's also a lot less fragile than you think. So, everyone's heard of the popular claim that a habit takes 21 days. Well, that's very misleading. There is some research from the University College of London which found that the average time for someone to reach at least a plateau into it becoming an automatic habit is roughly about 66 days. Now, that's the average. It could range depending on like a simple task, it could take 14 days. For a more complex situation, like in changing your diet or lifestyle, that could be 254 days. It just depends on the person, the behavior, so on and so forth. Now, the important finding that I do want to bring up is that missing one opportunity does not reset the process. There are neural and behavioral learning that just doesn't disappear because of one imperfect day. So just because you skip running for one day, that does not mean you start all the way over from day 1 to get to day 66. So, a practical way to help you build this type of self trust in yourself, seeing that we're starting off small, because we never want to go really, really big and disappoint ourselves. And then we end up into this toxic narrative of, I failed again. I don't know what I'm doing. I shouldn't have started. We want to do extremely small, tiny promises to ourselves. So, they should be actions that are so small, it feels ridiculous not to do them. Okay. An example is if you're trying to work on your arm strength, maybe do 5 push ups before you go to the shower or before you get into the shower. It's one thing that is a vote into the person that you want to become. So much as getting 1 glass of water in right after you wake up. Very, very small, not dramatic at all. And at the beginning, the reason why you want to focus on such small steps is that you don't want to create a dramatic physical result. Okay, not the real purpose of this. The purpose is to establish the relationship between intention and action. If you become a person that repeatedly follows through on those small promises, your brain then receives evidence that you, as a person, are reliable. You do follow through on the things that you say that you're going to do. And that shows up even in the tiny, minute steps that you think would just be nothing. And with this, you end up creating a reinforcement loop. So your action builds self trust, builds your identity. And then the stronger the identity, the less the friction associated with the next action. So you're more, what is the way I want to say it? Instead of arguing against a negative person to get to like a positive outcome, you're now building a record that contradicts any type of negative talk that you're telling yourself, any type of negative thoughts that you're seeing, because you're proving to yourself that this can be done. You can do it, and you're proving it to yourself time and time again. Now, when it comes to identity, the second part that I'll get into is that your identity needs an environment to support the action that you're doing. Identity work alone is not going to overcome every physical barrier that you have. So you can be a person that writes affirmations on the wall and few just letters to yourself, but they don't really have as much impact when it's 5 a.m. and you're trying to get up because you told yourself this is the last time that you're going to get stuck sleeping in late, so on and so forth. So look at your habits as things that are strongly connected to cues or contexts. The best way to explain it is that your identity and intention can influence where you want to go, but your physical environment acts like the track. So consider yourself a conductor of a train, right? You can't remain in the engine room of the train and then try and steer the train to a new direction through willpower. The tracks are going to continue leading towards the old destination until you move yourself out of the engine room, get to the front of the train, and then go ahead and change the tracks into a completely different direction. Now, there are ways for a person to build internal identity through small, repeated parts of evidence by making the friction point as minimal as possible. So, the night before, putting your running shoes by your bed so you can slide them on, or have a book placed by your bedside so that when you get in bed, you can read those last 10 pages. If you set yourself up that way, it's almost impossible for you not to pick up that new habit, to not see it there, to not notice something new that you are implementing yourself. So, the physical environment can carry part of the burden, especially on days when motivation is low. So, in other words, if you stay ready, you don't have to get ready. Now, it is something that I do want to touch on because we see it a lot in hustle culture, but it is extremely harmful to try and build an identity that is built around constant work, constant grinding, constant treating exhaustion like it's evidence for ambition, because it's not. You will burn out a lot faster, and before you know it, you are falling so far off the tracks, you're back at step one or two when you really could have been at seven, eight, or 10 if you had just learned to implement some type of rest. Now, let me explain to you why rest is so important. So, during periods of reduced external demand, you're not doing as much. Your brain is processing all those experiences, it's consolidating everything you learned, and it's creating those connections in your brain so that you can come back with a full understanding of the concept that you just learned, that you've just been applying. If you are a person that continues to deprive themselves of this type of recovery, you're essentially undermining the consistency you're trying to build because your brain has no time to turn off and process the information that you learned. And at that point, it will just drop the information because it doesn't deem it as important because it's trying to, I don't know, basically catch up from everything else that you've been trying to do without having anywhere to unload any of this information. So it never transfers to your long term memory. But I digress because I went on a little bit of a tangent because I am a big sucker for making sure that you get your rest, get your time in, make sure you take care of your brain because honestly, the older that we're getting, you have to do more to keep that neuroplasticity going. You have to give your brain rest so that you can understand the processes that you're doing, be able to link new information with old information that you have so you can connect the dots in those things. But all in all, I just want you to know out of this whole thing that habit formation is real. It can be done, but it does require you to keep those small promises, design a supportive environment because I'm not saying that you can't do it without these tools, but it'd be a hell of a lot easier if you would just implement them where you can. And before you know it, you're doing way better than you were in 6 months. So, with that being said, thank you for tuning in. This is Des Ford, and I will see you guys later. Bye.